Perfect. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for everyone that's sharing where you're all joining us from. It's good to see where everyone is located throughout the U.S. So if you haven't already, feel free to type in the chat box where you're joining us from. Today, we're going to be giving you all an introduction to the Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project that's funded under the Office for Victims of Crime. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Next slide. Great, so you are going to have some tools so that way we're able to interact with each other. You'll see that there is a chat feature, which many of you have been chatting into. There you can use to make either comments, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in there. We will be answering questions throughout, and also we'll have a section at the very end to discuss any questions that you may have as we discuss the Housing TTA project and also the policy and procedures reviews that we'll be working with. You'll also see that you have a closed captioning button. It seems like that might be having some difficulty. So Avantika is actually going to put a link right now in the chat box. If you click on that, it'll open up a new tab that will have the closed captioning. And so we'll be having that available today. I believe somebody had already asked if we will have the recording and the slide deck available. We will, so we'll be recording today, and we'll also be sharing out this recording with you all in the next week or two. And so just look out for that, and anything that we reference, we'll make sure to include it there, including any sort of resources that we talk about today. We're gonna go ahead and go into our next slide. Great, and so it might seem a little redundant to go see the same people on that slide deck as well as on video. So we're really excited to get to see you all today. I'm just gonna go ahead and introduce our team. You'll get to work with us and know us over the next 3 years. So we're really excited to be able to chat with you all today and get to know you all. So just to give you some brief background, my name is Karen Romero. I am the Training Institute Director. And so I oversee the Housing TTA project for Freedom Network USA. I am a native Spanish speaker, so my background has been around victim services for really my whole career. I started off working as a bilingual therapist for a rape recovery center. I was trained in EMDR there, and I also directed a domestic violence shelter, overseeing a team of case managers for domestic violence victims and their children. I also served as a social services director for a local NGO in DC. And then most recently, I worked as at Polaris, which oversees the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And I served as their training and survivor services manager. We also have Tatiana joining us today. She is the training specialist at Freedom Network USA. She's going to be working very closely with many of you as far as providing some support around the policy and procedures that you all are working for with your housing program. And she also worked as a bilingual case manager at a domestic violence shelter. She additionally worked as a coordinator, and I'm gonna pause right there. I feel like my printer might be trying to print something. So if you hear that, I might just take a second and unplug it, but it seems like it might be okay. So we'll just keep going. But she worked as the coordinator for Spanish services for an agency that supported families preparing to care for children in foster care. And most recently, she worked as a study coordinator at a laboratory in the Bronx. And then we also have the great pleasure of having Avantika Shinoy with us. She is our coordinator, and she works with OVC grantees to support training activities and technical assistance. So if you ever have a question, just anything related to housing that you're curious about, any resources that you're wanting to get in touch with, we're always happy to connect, and Avantika is a great part of that. She used to be the case manager intern at the Mara Legal Center, and they are a legal service organization in Washington, D.C. that provides pro bono legal services for anyone whose rights have been violated while being involved in commercial sex. And then she also interned as a legal aid assistant for an anti-trafficking organization in Nepal. So luckily, I feel like we have a team that understands where most of you all are coming from. We've all done direct services, and we hope to be able to match what your needs are as far as ensuring that you have the support and really the just the motivation, knowing that there's a whole team here ready to help you all. And so we'll talk about what this training and technical assistance actually looks like. So let's go to the next slide. Perfect. So we wanted to get a sense of where you all are at. I think for me as a direct service provider, I was not familiar with TTA before. So we're just going to do a quick poll. And if you could just chime in on what you believe TTA stands for. So you'll see a few options there. And we'll go ahead and give you a minute so that way everyone can participate and let us know what you think TTA stands for. Okay, perfect. Great. So it seems like we have a good mix, which we appreciate. You should be able to see the results. So training and team assistance, we got some for that. Training and technical assistance, we have the majority of participants selecting that. Technical and transformation assistance, and then toddlers and tiaras association. I wish we were doing the last one. We're not, but maybe one day when we'll get there. We are training and technical assistance. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that actually looks like in practice in supporting you all. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Perfect. So with the project for housing training and technical assistance, our goal is really to support you all as grantees to ensure that you have the tools, the information, and the connections to be able to serve survivors on their needs, the wide array of needs around housing. And so that may be learning about new housing opportunities or solutions, or maybe they're not new, they might be new to the field, but they're, they've been in existence in a different space like housing and homelessness. We also support connections to housing and homelessness services and sources, for example, continuums of care, housing authorities, HUD-funded programs. And so if you are curious about, you may already have experience with them, types of programs, we'd love to always connect. We all know how things are working for people in the field as far as housing goes, what type of challenges you're seeing, and not challenges, but successes, because our goal is to always share best practices, what is working, what are some potential solutions that we can all, learn.
Hi, I'm sorry, my internet died.
So no worries. So we'll get that back. But as I was saying, I feel like housing can be such a challenge, not just in maintaining housing and accessing housing. And sometimes what we know, and sometimes there might be some additional opportunities, some systems that we are not familiar with that could be an option for survivors, but we just historically don't tap into them. And so our goal and really what we strive for is to try and make those connections on both sides, on the human trafficking field and also in the housing and homeless services field. So we are really excited to be able to bring this type of work to you and acknowledging that there's a lot of expertise that you all have. And we are very much looking forward to sharing that, between you and us, but also making connections across the US. I think some of the best learning is peer-to-peer, and wherever we are able to connect service providers from different locations, we want to make sure that we're doing that. Lots of people are struggling and doing similar work, so we don't want to recreate the wheel. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Perfect. So what does TTA entail, right? What does training and technical assistance entail? It can be basically what you need it to be. We want it to be useful. So it may be that it's problem solving. You might have some questions around, your program. How do I, work with substance use if I have a residential program? How do I work to ensure that our program is really open and accessible for different populations? And I'll talk about this a little later, but thinking about LGBTQ plus populations, male populations, foreign nationals, etc. And so it might be that you might have a very specific challenge or issue, and we're always open and happy to, talk through it and tell you kind of what we know, what we've seen, some potential resources, and make connections wherever we think it might be useful. Sharing information, anything that if you are curious about any HUD-funded program or understanding what a continuum of care is, how partnerships work, we always want to break that information down in a way that makes sense to us. I think sometimes we have a little bit of a language difference or just how we use different terminology. We want to make sure that we are understanding it in a way that makes sense to the anti-trafficking field, and that we're able to connect and access to some of those resources that might be a little more on the housing and homelessness field. Also support. Sometimes, you may not be sure on how to implement certain models. You might be curious on using, for example, like flexible funding or taking in some rental assistance or rapid rehousing. We can provide you support with that. Feedback, obviously that's going to come into play with our policies and procedures. Connections, we talk to a lot of housing programs, and we're very fortunate to get to know you all. So we are always interested in making connections. Again, we feel like peer-to-peer support and connections is great. We have some information. We don't, assume or pretend to know it all. And so wherever we can connect you, we want to do that. And then finally, training. We have, if there are questions that you have around just what sort of housing and homelessness programs there are, either under HUD or in your local community, we can talk about those. We can do some training on best practices on different housing models for your staff and your local community partners, whatever is useful to you. So what does TTA entail? It is support to you around housing with this specific project around what your needs are. And we are here to support you in the way that it is useful to you. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Awesome. And so for the project, there are a number of different ways that we are able to provide this training and technical assistance. And these are going to be some options that you're going to see coming up very soon, and if you haven't already. So one, we have web-based trainings. Every other month, we hold a webinar and or peer support calls, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So with webinars, we select topics that we know are coming up a lot for service providers in the anti-trafficking field, and it may be on a topic related to housing, it may be on a specific program, on a model of housing or a assistance program, or it may be on different demographics of survivors. And so we want to hear from you what type of trainings are useful, because we want them to be timely, we want them to be relevant, and we utilize project partners throughout our whole project that are comprised of direct service providers as well as survivors with lived experience to not just inform the work, but really to draft up content to deliver a lot of this training, because we want you hearing from those people that have that direct service experience. And so that's something that we do every other month. And the next one is going to be in November, and that's going to be around using VOCA funding to support housing. So look out for a registration email that will be coming out in the next few weeks. The next piece is on technical assistance. So this can be a call, it can be a video call, it can be an email, whatever you feel comfortable with. Shoot us a message at training@freedomnetworkusa.org. We have our housing page on freedomnetworkusa.org where you can submit an inquiry if you're curious, have questions, want to discuss anything, where you're able to access us those ways. Everything that we develop, including fact sheets, toolkits around housing, are uploaded on our website on our resource library, and you'll see that there is an icon that says housing. And if you just click on that, it will give you everything housing related. So all of our recordings, all of our webinars, toolkits, fact sheets, templates, you'll see them there. And then finally, with policies and procedures, we get to support you all in working through what do policies and procedures look like as far as ensuring that they're voluntary, that they're trauma-informed, and that they're person-centered. And then Tatiana will talk a little bit more about what that process will look like. We've already started engaging with a number of you around this, and so we'll go more deeply into that. All right, perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over the next slide to Avantika.
All right, thanks, Karen. And I'm sorry, my internet's kind of spotty, so I hope everybody is able to hear me and everyone's able to see me. If you're having any issues, just let me know in the chat box. So Karen did a really great introduction of, what our project is about, what we're offering folks, for OVC grantees, especially you all, who we're going to be working very closely with. So we have had this project for over like 2 years now, and over the past 2 years, close to 3 years now, actually, yeah, 3 years now, and we have been providing webinars and peer support calls as a really big part of the training that we're providing the field. So all the trainings that we're providing, webinars as well as peer support calls, are related to housing and human trafficking. And Karen also did mention this earlier, was that the way that we're actually selecting the topics is by working with project partners who are working on the ground in the field, and as well as hearing from you all, like what are the needs that you're seeing. Some of the topics that we've covered in the past, we started, our first webinar that we ever did was on just covering like the landscape of housing that's available. So housing, there is a lot, and the field itself is very complex. So what we try to do within our trainings is to make that information more digestible and easier for everybody to sort of understand in the anti-trafficking field. So we had a webinar on covering what the landscape is like of housing options. We've also covered topics like continuums of care. What does it mean? What is a continuum of care, and how can you be involved in your local continuum of care? We have covered also topics specific to marginalized populations, like housing for male survivors and housing boys, as well as housing LGBTQ survivors. That was our latest webinar that we just did. Since COVID started and we started to see more needs around housing, we also started to sort of foster and facilitate a peer-to-peer learning, learning like space, and that's where our peer support calls sort of started, and this is what we're also trying to continue on. So we started having a call just to see what our partners are doing on the ground, how are they housing survivors, and how are they sort of navigating through through everything that's going on right now, and how are they still able to do it during COVID. And then we had some other peer support calls, which were specific again to COVID, but around eviction moratoriums, around housing undocumented survivors, and a few others. And you can find all of this on our resource library. We have all the recordings on the resource library as well as the YouTube channel. So I'm just going to put the link for the resource library. And as Karen mentioned earlier, if you hit on the housing for survivors, you're able to find all the resources with the recordings of the peer support calls, as well as the webinars, as well as the other resources that we're going to be talking to you about. So other than having web-based trainings like the webinars as well as the peer support calls, we also have fact sheets. These fact sheets are designed specifically for anti-trafficking providers to talk about the various topics that surround housing. So as I mentioned earlier, housing, as we know, is very complicated. It's a complicated field. There's a lot of jargon that's used by the housing and homelessness providers. And then maybe if you're working with youth, the runaway and homeless youth system, they are also using different language. So what we try to do with these fact sheets is geared really towards anti-trafficking providers. It's to take these like complex systems and complex ideas around housing, the complex landscape around housing, and really break it down so that people on the front lines, you all who are working every day with survivors, are able to look at this information. Hopefully it's not as complicated, and you're able to sort of navigate and see what is out there. So some of the topics that we have included, so one of them, we have a fact sheet which also covers the landscape of housing. Then we also did a fact sheet very, very recently talking about housing survivors during COVID. We also have fact sheets on rapid rehousing programs like rapid rehousing, about the continuum of care, and it really breaks down what it is and how you can be involved with your continuum of care, etc. So again, this is available on the resource library, and if there's a specific topic that you're looking for and you're not able to find it, or if you're having some sort of difficulty, feel free to email us at training@freedomnetworkusa.org, and we're happy to point you to a specific resource. And that's, that kind of like segues into the other part about like contacting us and for us to sort of like work with you is our aspect of providing technical assistance. And the technical assistance, even though it's like a fancy term, but what it basically means is, just, what questions do you have? Like, it could be a question about something, it could be a question about like a specific thing that's happening in your shelter or in your program, or something that you're trying to learn a little bit more about. Like, are you trying to learn a little bit more about substance use? Like, what is that, especially in the context of housing? You could shoot us an email and we could either point you to resources, connect you with another organization in your community, or even just having a call like this, where we're doing like more of a one-on-one problem solving, where we're sort of like troubleshooting with you all. So we could do any of that. It's generally we generally like to have a call, or we could also troubleshoot via email. It's just about like us being there to support you however you need it. And these spaces are judgment free. Like, we have, like, all of us on the team have done direct services before, and we know that a lot of times like things are very, very stressful, and you're just trying to do your best, and you're just trying to make sure that survivors are safe and they're getting housing and everything. So we know where you're coming from. So we try to definitely foster an environment where you feel safe to also come to us with these questions. So this is definitely a space for open conversations, and feel free to come to any of us with any questions that you have about your program, or something that you're looking to learn in the realms of housing and human trafficking. And the way to do that is on our website we have a housing inquiry form. So I'm just going to put the link again for our website here. And if you scroll down, you can see that there's a housing inquiry form. So you can either fill that up, or you could just also email us at training@freedomnetworkusa.org. So I guess I'm just going to hand it back to Karen, and she's going to talk to you a little bit more about the housing summits that we've been doing.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Monica. So housing summits are a activity that we developed in order to support OVC grantees such as yourself and their local community partners in addressing housing for survivors of trafficking in a very localized way and a community approach. We selected for 5 sites, technically, there's 2 New York sites, in order to really get a good sense of what the differences are in different types of communities with different types of settings. And we were able to launch the first 2 in South Dakota and New Orleans last year / early this year. Obviously, due to the pandemic, we have to put those on hold, but we are still working with all of our grantees in order to who are participating in the housing summits in order to do some interim work, right? What can we do virtually? What type of support are we able to provide? So through those housing summits, we were identifying what the landscape looked like in those local communities. So not just who are your anti-trafficking programs and shelters, but thinking about who is your runaway and homeless youth service provider, who are, what type of HUD and housing authorities and people in the housing and homelessness field are available there, and really bringing them all in together, because there is a very similar and shared goal of addressing homelessness for the majority of these programs. They may just not be prioritizing or even seeing survivors of trafficking and how they fit there. And so a lot of that is really community building and understanding how to leverage and create those partnerships. So with the new awards, we plan to continue this. Once we are able to resume some in-person meetings, we will be reaching back out and let you know as those are moving forward. But of course, because there is a lot up in the air right now with the pandemic, and we can't have any certainty, we want to make sure that we're able to move forward with those safely. So feel free to ask any questions that you may have on those, but just know that those are, you know, kind of on pause as far as the in-person activities go. So we're going to go ahead and go on to the next slide, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tatiana, who's going to be reviewing some information on policies and procedures.
All right, so let's talk policies and procedures. Next slide. So what is the purpose of policies and procedures? Mainly, we just want to make sure that these documents ensure the services and their delivery are consistent, whether that is new folks coming into your program as staff, current staff. We just want to make sure that these reflect the type of work that you're doing. It also ensures that programs are trauma-informed, voluntary, and person-centered. And we will be speaking about this in a little bit, but essentially, we just want to make sure that these serve as a guide for your program and outline things like eligibility, timeframes, so like length of your program that is very specific, is outlined in a document, and that everyone's following the same. Again, parameters, so what kind of services are offered through your program, and what survivors are eligible for. So some of you may already have some documents that guide the work that you'll be doing for this new housing project. And some of you may be in the process of developing, drafting them, but wherever you are in the process, we are happy to help you with this. We've had some questions around how to get started, you know, if we have templates, and it really will depend on your specific program, but we are happy to help you get started with this. We want to make sure that you get on the right foot rather than do a lot of work and then have to kind of backtrack a little bit. So feel free to reach out to us. We're definitely happy to help. If I haven't emphasized that enough, we want to make sure that we're able to serve the survivors as best as we can. As far as the review itself, Avantika, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So as a reminder, we cover this in the OVC new grantee orientation, but just to have a refresher, you are due to turn in your review, your policies and procedures by November 14th. So that's the 60 days from when that took place. The process itself, you'll have to turn in the policies and procedures both to OVC and then send it in to us. And then what we'll do from there is just set up a call. Once we receive it, we will be touching base with you and asking you if you could have an hour of your time just to kind of walk us through your program, make sure that we're understanding what you're doing, and that we just get to know you and your program. So we'll be setting up a time to do that, and after that we'll begin the process. So we'll start looking at your policies and procedures, offering feedback, and the process may take some, like maybe 2 to 4 months. This is my job, so I'm doing this, but I know, and again, all of us on the team have been service providers, so I know that it can be crazy and it can be a little busy. So if you don't get back to me, within a reasonable time frame, that's okay. I'll be reaching out, and that's all to say that we'll be working on this together. So I'll share a box folder with you where we will collaborate and set up a time to go through the comments, make sure. A lot of the times something on paper doesn't come across the way that it's meaning to, doesn't reflect what you're actually trying to do. So we want to make sure that those that I understand what the work is. And so we'll collaborate, we'll work back and forth, and then once you're done, we will provide you with a letter to submit to OVC with your revised documents. So that all should go together and then sent to OVC. I think that's it for me. If you want to go to the next slide.
Perfect. Thank you, Tatiana. And just as Tatiana was saying, this is very much an area that we want to collaborate and be as useful to you. So if you are worried or anxious in any way, please don't be. This is very like a judgment-free zone. We are a TA provider, so we're not the ones, enforcing any sort of like requirements, but we do want you to be able to reflect the great work that you're doing through your policies and procedures, and also knowing that a lot of programs, especially those that have been doing this work for a long time, may have written policies and procedures long ago that it would be good to maybe do a refresher. And so I'm just going to touch on some of the areas that we're going to be looking at, so that way if you are already in the process of developing or reviewing, just know kind of what framework we're coming from. So we're coming from a rights-based, trauma-informed, person-centered like value system. And so we believe that housing is a human right. That means that we want to make sure that people, especially survivors, have access, low barrier to no barrier access to housing, and that we're not, as service providers, requiring them to earn their housing by completing X, Y, or Z, right? Having those prerequisites that end up really excluding a lot of survivors. We don't want housing treated as a carrot, as a reward for good behavior or what we think is good behavior, especially because we know that the impact of housing, or lack of housing can be so detrimental in somebody's healing or just in their stability. So we want people to have housing first and then be able to have that wraparound services. With the trauma-informed, I think this is a word that gets shared often. A lot of us may have it in our mission statement or how we do our practice, but we wanted to show up in the actual practice of services. So acknowledging how trauma has been experienced, how it does impact an individual and how it may come across, really starting to move away completely from our expectations of a perfect client or what we think should be the good behavior, because every person is different and everyone does deserve access to housing, and not replicating the dynamics of trafficking. I'll be talking about this in just a moment. I think it's in our next slide. But unfortunately, as providers, especially as housing providers, we hold a lot of power over the survivor because we have a resource that they need, and we administer this resource, and oftentimes we decide who is eligible, who's able to access, who's not. And unfortunately, a lot of times we do exclude survivors. I think in my own practice, I saw now in retrospect, looking back, that we were maybe screening out more than we were screening in. And there are, a lot of lessons learned, but also we just, in supporting programs, I think we have been able to see how a lot of programs struggle with similar things. So we'll be sharing a little bit more about that. But on the person-centered side is really centering the services around the survivor. What is it that they need? How do we prioritize their goals in order to support their autonomy, respecting their experience? And so instead of having a project plan or a plan for the survivor that is based on what we think is what they need, it's really understanding what is it that they want, what type of housing would they like to get to at, in their ideal situation, and how can we be a support system to get them there. And so we're really hoping that these values and practice especially are coming through as you are serving survivors, and that's reflected on your policies and procedures. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. For this practice, I think we really wanted to break it down, how some of the practices, policies, and procedures that we have within our programs can very closely replicate that experience of a trafficking situation. So we know that a number of programs have mandated services. Mandated is basically that people are either expected or told, or as a condition of housing, have to engage in detox, chores, therapy, religious activities, case management, etc., where really it's taking away their choice, right? So we want to be really, really mindful, not just mindful of that, we don't want to engage in activities that are mandated. And so we want to be just very upfront and very clear with that intention of ensuring that we are not replicating and re-traumatizing survivors through our services. I know a lot of times it's well-intentioned. I think a lot of the questions that we get is around safety and security. And so we just want to have very honest and open conversations around what does that mean? And really, when we're talking about safety, it is, what does safety mean for the survivor? So we may have a very different definition, or the way that we frame safety for us might be very different than how a survivor may frame safety for them. And it's going to vary from survivor to survivor. So this is where best practices of trauma-informed care and person-centered approaches really come in. It's really putting that into practice. Limiting communication, another thing that we see often, whether it's taking away cell phones or restricting who can the person talk to. So remember, this was also very likely something that they experienced with their trafficker, is that they were isolated, that they also had their cell phone taken away, or screened, or really looking at who they're communicating with. Again, that is not best practice. We should not be engaging in this type of behavior, and so we want to make sure that we're not replicating that. Curfews, chores, locked facilities. So again, a lot of this replicates the control that has been used in a trafficking situation in order to make sure that the survivor stays there. And really, we don't want to add and continue that traumatization that has already happened. And although it may seem scary to shift, and I can understand shift can be very scary and anxiety provoking, I think if we really look at how our programs are working, especially if we're implementing any of these, I'm sure that both frontline staff, people who are working with survivors, and survivors especially themselves, probably do not want any of these, nor enjoy them, nor is it best practice. And so I think it really is in the benefit of just the survivor, the program, the field, to ensure that we are coming from a voluntary services standpoint, being trauma-informed and person-centered. We'll go to the next slide. And I just want to, as we're transitioning to the next slide, I do want to point out that we are having a webinar around voluntary services, like what that model actually looks like, on December 3rd. And so you'll see a registration email coming out in the next month or so. But I just wanted to put it on your radar that will be coming out. And I just wanted to raise, kind of a flag for some underserved populations that we can also help support you in thinking about how to best make programs that are accessible to these populations. So we know that labor trafficking survivors are often underserved, but a lot of times excluded from programs, because most programs, especially residential and housing programs, are usually catering to sex trafficking survivors who are female identified. Most of the time, that is going to exclude labor trafficking survivors, boys and men. Foreign nationals can be often excluded, and LGBTQ survivors. So these are areas that we have expertise within our project partners, and also we know a lot of programs that are working and have successfully implemented some really neat practices. So we would love to connect you if this is an area, any of these, and really any population that you're not as familiar, or you're curious about what to do in order to best support these, whether it's somebody that you're a demographic or a group that you're not as used to or familiar with, or somebody that you just haven't really seen the need for. It may not be that the need is not there. It may be that our program is just not really accessible or really reaching out to those populations. So just know that under these populations, where we have definitely lots of connections and resources that we can connect you to. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide. Perfect. And so just, we have a couple more slides before we get into the Q&A. And so we just wanted to give you some pointers and tips as we get started with especially the policy and procedure review. So to give you like overall key takeaway, and I'll probably repeat it, is voluntary services means not mandating services. And that, again, could probably sound scary because we feel like if we're not holding survivors accountable, they couldn't possibly, get through a program. They can, and they will, and they have gone, along without us for a long time. And so we want to make sure that voluntary services is actually being reflected in how your program practices and delivers services. So that way we're not re-traumatizing survivors, that we're not creating a power and control differential, which already exists, right? There's already that dynamic. We want to acknowledge it, and we want to make sure that we're addressing it. So that means we don't want to see, as far as the policies and procedures go, things like mandated therapy or detox, really thinking about, I think a lot of programs, sometimes what we hear is we feel like they need to go to this before they can be successful in housing. That's not necessarily the case. That's actually not the case. So we want to just be very mindful of the barriers that we as providers are putting up in order for people to access housing. Trauma-informed services is, again, not creating practices that re-traumatize survivors. So not taking away cell phones, not requiring chores. One of the areas that, if you think about a labor trafficking survivor, especially somebody that may came out of like domestic servitude, who was exploited through, cleaning or whatever that looked like. And then we, as a service provider, we're requiring chores, which are unpaid, right? So again, we're replicating some of these practices. And although that may not be the intention, we need to acknowledge and address the impact that we're having. And so that's something that we want to be really, really mindful of. Also, I know that curfews are something that's very common, especially within like residential programs and shelters. And so, with curfews, I think one of the areas that we often find is that people just want to make sure that they're utilizing the space, that somebody is coming in and that they're safe. And with that, I think, can a service provider 100% guarantee safety? No, I think that's a lot of weight to put on yourself and on your staff. And also we hear, the need around wanting to understand the safety and extend that safety for not just one survivor, but for that whole community or those residents. And so with curfews, we also want you to think about survivors that may have to work throughout the night, and how that may not be flexible for them. And again, we're ending up creating more barriers than anything. And how can you create more flexibility within your program to ensure that we are not being so strict that it's really going to end up screening out the majority of survivors, because there may be just a handful that fit. And even them, they may not want, the type of services. But I think with housing, if we're creating people who are desperate for housing, they're gonna tell us what we need to hear in order to access housing. And one of our colleagues who's on the DV side, she always says, like, we don't want to make clients lie to us to access housing. And I think that's very true. If we ask or mandate services, they may do them, but it's not because they necessarily want them. I think creating that option and giving that option is great, but we don't want to create a system or a field or a service where individuals are feeling like they have to in order to gain housing. So we want to be just super mindful of that. And then finally, with survivor-centered services, it's really prioritizing the survivor and what they need and what they want. And so with housing, is understanding what would your ideal situation be. A lot of them, I think it's going to be permanent housing, right? So in the meantime, how can we support you? What are some of the ways that we can get you connected? And knowing that permanent housing, there are some supports and there are some resources available through housing and homelessness that if we as providers are familiar with them, we're able to better make those connections. And that's where we are more than in all these areas, but that's one of the areas that we get really excited about, is expanding just how many connections and safety net, expanding that safety net for them. All right, we're gonna go ahead and move to the next slide. So for key takeaways, what we wanted to make sure that you get from from today was to make sure that you are able to reach out. Like that Dana emphasized, she is happy to help. We are happy to help. This is, what our project is meant to do. So it is not a burden. It is not, if you're anxious or you're not sure, just reach out. We are more than happy to support you in the way that it is useful to you. So it's not a predetermined idea that we have. It's more, what is useful? Where are you at? Let's meet there and let's figure out what would be some good steps forward. So make sure you submit your policies and procedures by the 14th. Also connecting around any technical and training assistance that could be useful to you. So if it's, if you're already done with your policies and procedures and there's anything else that you're curious about, connect with us. As far as housing, we are happy to connect. If it's something else, we have a good number of TTA providers at OVC that I'm sure we could connect you with and find the right person with that expertise. One of the most important things is we know that there are a number of staff members who are probably part of your project or your program, and so we want to suggest that you have them connect with us or with the listserv, just so they're alerted to upcoming activities and resources, because every time we have any publication, and by publication I mean like fact sheets or templates, any sort of webinar coming up or training opportunity, we want to make sure that they're getting it. I know that sometimes in our experience, sometimes it's like the grant manager or writer that gets our emails at the organization, which is great, and we would hope that they will pass it on to other staff members, and sometimes it may not get as widely distributed. But we want this, there's no minimum or maximum of people who can be on from your team. Definitely feel free to share with your staff, and if there's partners that you think would find benefit from webinars or fact sheets or whatnot, feel free to share it with them too. Perfect. So I think we're gonna go ahead and move on to questions. We have about 15 minutes. So we'll just get started, and let me just pull up our questions. We got some questions coming in during the chat, so we'll answer those as well. And we also had some questions from registration. And so the first one, I'll start off with, and Avantika and Tatiana, feel free to chime in, is can our agency's transitional housing program be alcohol and drug-free while still allowing supportive services to be voluntary in the program? So that is a great question, super common. I think that this is a very real struggle with a lot of housing providers, is they want, the want and desire to create like a drug-free, alcohol-free environment. And I think that desire sometimes ends up creating a very strict program where it might be if you have drugs or alcohol on yourself or in your room, you get exited, right? We need to be very realistic about what these substances have been. They've probably been a part, if they're already using these substances, they probably were a part of that person's lives. They were likely part of the trafficking situation. We know that's super common. And so what we want to really think through, and we've seen a lot of programs have success with, is a harm reduction model, right? Understanding that we, as a service provider, we're not going to change the client, right? That's not our role. That's not why we're here. And I understand the safety concern. So can you require somebody to not use alcohol or drugs while they're there? No, I mean, and be voluntary, right? Like that's a little contradictory. And also remembering that, yeah, alcohol can definitely be a coping mechanism. And so we want to be very, again, this comes to the trauma-informed, person-centered, voluntary services model. What does that look like? In understanding kind of where's the root of our concern? Is it that we think every single survivor is going to start using? Is it that it's going to be triggering for other people? It could happen, sure. I don't think every survivor is going to start using, but I think in my experience, what I've seen, especially working in a shelter, is that sometimes we would start making up rules and policies and procedures because one person did, whatever behavior, whatever it was. And so then we wanted to make sure that we're doing the best to not have that behavior repeated by anyone else, that just policies and procedures and rules started stacking up, and then it felt like we're having rules every other month, and it was a new one, and we're just adding to this binder. And also it was just creating a dynamic for our advocates, who are doing a lot of the frontline work that was very uncomfortable, and that wasn't necessarily what they wanted to do, you know. So we don't want people to be drug screened. Like, that's not a role, and that's not something that we were trained for, and we want to be just really mindful. So I think that's a conversation that, you know, you may want to, we're always open to having it and to sharing how some programs have been able to work through that. We know of a program who said, you know, we know that there might be residents, and because it's communal living spaces, we know that there might be some residents that are trying to keep themselves clean. And so, you know, we request that if you are still engaging with substances, if you could do it off premises, that would be, you know, just really great. And it's, again, having that judgment-free space, because it may be that somebody may want detox, maybe, and it may be that somebody may not, and that's totally okay. But if we have a very punitive measures for somebody displaying or saying, you know, I have a challenge, or I'm using substances, that one, they're likely not going to tell us about it, and two, they're going to do it in a way that's probably more harmful than if we were able to really address what their needs are, and how we can, you know, support like the community and them, and also acknowledge that there is this very real thing, whether it's, you know, drugs or alcohol. So that's what I'll say for that one. Tatiana and Avantika, do you all have any thoughts on that?
I think you covered it. I just wanted to add just a small point, is that like sometimes even, you know, if you're trying to maybe, you know, have these rules and you think that it's for their best, it might be just more harmful, right? So as Karen mentioned in the slides earlier, with talking about like, you know, certain practices, they model what's happening in situations, in the trafficking situation itself. So sometimes just having restrictions is more harmful, because it is modeling certain restrictive behaviors that they were a part of before.
And just to chime in, I was going to say what you emphasized, Karen, just being able to ask them, you know, how can we make this safer? And be having really candid conversations with the survivors as to why these rules are in place. You know, maybe discussing like, there are people here who are on probation. How can we make, if you're going to engage in you know, continuing drug use or whatever it is, making sure that the safety aspect is what they think is safe. So yeah, just to echo that.
Thank you. And because we've seen a number of questions around this, I do feel like this could be a really great topic for a webinar. And so I think that's what I'm hearing from this group. And so we would love to put something together on, you know, how, like, the very real concerns, and also how does it work? How can it work? So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question. And I'll start off with Avantika. So do you have any thoughts on balancing the safety of other residents and staff with resident autonomy? So for example, thoughts on blackout periods on using cell phones.
I think, again, it's, you know, with things like blackout periods, with things like, you know, trying to create an environment that you think is safe is sometimes more harmful than helpful. It is really important to see what safety looks like for the survivor, right? So it is kind of about having that conversation. I completely understand where people come from when, you know, you want to do like a detox or take away the phones just to reset, you know, folks into another environment. But sometimes you just need the phone to be connected to friends or family, especially if you are working with a young person. Social media is something that everybody is on all the time. And that is what you need for connection with, you know, the outside world. So that might be more harmful than helpful. Now, there might be people who want to do a voluntary blackout period. There might be people who don't want to use the phone, but that is, again, an individual basis. It is about actually just talking to the survivor and figuring it out. And as Tatiana mentioned before, it's, again, if your concern is about safety, if the rule is in place because of safety, it is kind of addressing that concern and talking about like what safety actually looks like for the group, for the survivor, and for the staff.
Perfect. Thank you, Monica. The next question is, what are our thoughts on offering incentives for chores and attending services? So I think in general, I can see how incentives have been useful. I think with, certain groups, I'm thinking like youth, that might be, a good way to maybe reward just, their participation. I think what you want to be careful of though, is what sort of model you're creating, or you might be creating by rewarding the behaviors that we think or that the program thinks are good. So for example, if you're rewarding therapy, and somebody chooses that they don't want to go to therapy, we don't want to make that dynamic where this survivor is doing good. They're engaging in good behavior because you're going to therapy, where somebody may not want that for themselves, which is completely fine. Or if they don't want to participate, in house meetings, or people have many reasons why they may not be ready or want to or choose to engage in certain things. So I think being really mindful of how you're implementing an incentive program as to not, create the appearance, and I mean, quite frankly, that would be how it would have come across to me, of saying like, oh, you're going to therapy, so good job, let me give you an incentive on that. You're doing chores, good job, let me give you an incentive on that. I do think it creates a bit of a discrepancy for survivors that may not be engaging. And also I hear, I think the intention would probably be to like acknowledge and like celebrate, as different things are happening for survivors, which they need to be celebrated for. And so I would think about which ways you might be able to do that on different like milestones that they're hitting for them. So you said that you wanted to do X goal, which is their self-identified goal. That is great. Like, let's acknowledge that. So that would be my feedback on that. Tatiana and Avantika, I'm not sure if you all have anything to chime in.
I think you got it. I think just making sure that, like you said, some folks are going to want to engage in some things that we think may be good, but what are we creating by saying, oh, you get a star for this, you get a sticker, and other people don't? And so I think being really mindful of the message that we're not really saying, but maybe through our actions we're getting across. So
awesome, thank you. We had a question about any statistical data on shelters that practice harm reduction. I personally don't think I've seen any, and I think there's a couple of reasons why. I think the majority of shelters do not practice harm reduction. I think that's one reason. I think where we can see and take some lessons learned is through the runaway and homeless youth systems. I feel like they have been very, I would say proactive, but also intentional as much as they can on like marrying these approaches together. And especially those that are serving LGBTQ survivors. I feel like that's where I hear most of like that approach being taken. And so I would definitely be curious to like check in and see if they have some of that. Personally, I haven't seen it in the anti-trafficking field. I think one of the reasons is that not the majority, in my experience, do not come from that approach, although that is starting to shift. And in the housing and homelessness world, that is definitely the shift is housing first, right? You house a person first, because if they're housed, they're better able to engage in services that are useful for them. And so I feel like that's where the one best practices, but also where most of these fields are going, especially as they relate to housing. So I will look into that, and then if we find resources that may be useful, we'll link them to the follow-up email. The next question, and we'll probably have to end with that one. Tatiana, so a couple questions. One, are you able to support providers on reviewing policies and procedures or creating them? And along with that, what do you feel are some examples of good policies and procedures?
great. So if I wasn't emphatic enough before, I'm happy to help develop these and help you. If you have some drafts, like I said, send them my way, training at freedomnetworkusa.org. And I'm happy to take a look at whatever you've got going on first. Sometimes there's individuals that like, I don't want to send them until they're not ready. I've had plenty of conversations to get to assist with the beginning of these and get you on the right foot. Like I said, we don't want to have you go like 30 pages. No policies and procedures should be 30 pages anyway, but we want to make sure that you get some work that's meaningful, that's helpful, and that really just gets across what your program is meant to do. So yes, definitely. And Karen, your second question, examples. I think really just making sure you're intentional about what the things that you're putting down on paper is, right? So if you're saying we have these services available, sometimes we use the words strongly encouraged, or we say like highly suggested. And I think that still comes again with the underlying words of like, yeah, you should do it. But I've seen it worded as you may use this as much or as little as you want. And I think that again puts the emphasis on autonomy and self-determination. So those two things. So again, curfews, we talked about, blackout periods, and just things like that. Just make sure that you're thinking about, how would I feel if I was coming out of this situation and I was looking for services, going to a place that that has been referred, or that that I've heard offers good things, and then having all these conditions placed on what I need at the moment. And like Karen said, sometimes these things, they come across like, if we're putting conditions on these services that we really want to be out there because we want to help, right? But are we putting barriers up for individuals? So I don't know that I have a specific one, but just thinking about those three values, that it's hard to practice them, right? Because maybe we've been doing things separately, or differently rather, but just thinking about how to reframe these things from a trauma-informed, person-centered voluntary service model.
Awesome. Thank you, Tatiana and Monica. And thank you all for your questions. Again, the intention behind all of this, we all, I think, all come to this work with our intentions and goals of supporting survivors. And, you know, in the way we started off all, you know, what we thought was best practice. I mean, a lot of you are seasoned and have been doing this work for a long time. So we want to learn from each other. And we have a really great opportunity to ensure that we're all providing consistent services, right, throughout the US, and that whether a person is accessing services in California versus New York or Texas or Minnesota or wherever you may be, is knowing that we're going to provide that level of service where it's going to be for them, that it is meant to support them, and that we are, you know, doing this work together as a field. And so we are excited to learn from you all. We will be connecting very soon. And if you have any questions, let us know. Whatever questions are not getting answered, I think we'll try to just do a document and reply via text, and then attach that to our follow-up email. So look out for that in the next week or two. Share it with whoever wasn't able to make it. And we're looking forward to getting to know you all a little bit more. Thank you all.